Class. This week, we're going to be talking about college and career readiness for students with disabilities. I apologize that my camera just decided to quit working yesterday, so I don't have a functioning camera right now. But I'm here, and nonetheless, we're going to go ahead and go through this. Hopefully, you got quite a bit out of the article, the Mary Morningstar article around the research about college and career readiness for students with disabilities. But essentially, our learning intentions for this week are that you will be able to describe the 6 domains of college and career readiness for students with disabilities. And I'm also going to share with you kind of a lot of other resources we have at the State Board of Education and kind of what competencies are for all students in Utah to be college and career ready. And we'll kind of compare some of those to the research around specifically students with disabilities. And then I really want you to be able to know how to find local resources, including our special education rules and what they say about college and career readiness for students with disabilities, and also other general resources that we have at State Board of Education in the special ed section, as well as gen ed kinds of resources. So we'll go through both of those. And so first, I just want to talk about, why do you think this idea of college and career readiness is so important with students, for students with disabilities? I think historically, we haven't really thought necessarily about preparing students for college and career. I think part of that kind of comes from that idea of low expectations, or thinking that students with disabilities, couldn't handle college, right? And certainly we've come a long way. And I also think that our laws, state and federal, now really speak to having higher expectations for students with disabilities and making sure that they have access to general education content. I can remember back to when I first started teaching special ed, and I was teaching actually junior high students. And instead of assessing our students on regular grade level assessments, I, as a special ed teacher, was actually allowed to choose and give them an off-level assessment. So, for example, I was teaching 7th graders, but I would assess them on like 3rd or 4th grade assessments, right? That was actually allowed. And this was about 25 years ago, maybe, or more. That is no longer the case, right? Like, we need to make sure that students with disabilities have access to their general education core and that rigor so that we do better prepare them for college and career. But it isn't just about academics. So, historically, we were not really including, I think, students in this conversation, and not thinking they could, be successful in college. And I think that has definitely been proven wrong, but we do still see a lot of gaps between our students with disabilities, first and foremost going to college, but then successfully completing college as well, right? So we definitely still have work to do in that area. And then again, around that low expectation. So I think the more that we pull students out of general core curriculum and, sort of watered down curriculum, we're already lowering those expectations and already kind of setting them up in many cases, I think, for not for failure, but for more of a struggle, right? So a lot of times students with disabilities go to college and they find themselves remediating and having to take high school coursework again because they're not at that college level. So we'll talk about, how do we prevent that from happening, and how do we set our students up for success by making sure not only do they get that academic piece, but kind of all of those other important skills and knowledge that we should be providing and having students learn while they're in school. And then I just wanted to point out that our federal law around IDEA really does, state that one of the purposes of especially designed instruction and special education is not only to help them access the general core curriculum, but really one of the main purposes is also to prepare our students for success in further education, whatever that is, whether that's a 2 or 4 year college, or whether that's a tech college or some other kind of certificate program. but we want them to be successful ultimately so that they can get a higher paying job and they're not living in poverty, because we know students with disabilities, when they exit, oftentimes, do earn a lot less than their peers. And we also want them to be have the skills to live independently, right? So those are always our three lenses, is to prepare our students for that further education, employment, and independent living. And that it literally says that right in the language. And then really making sure that, this whole idea of transition planning, again, it's not just that one page in the IEP to kind of check the boxes, but it's really a purposeful process to make sure that we are giving students all of those opportunities and skills, and feeling like they're leaving our schools with the abilities to be successful in those post-secondary settings, which are so different from our high school settings. And we've talked a lot about that. But I wanted to kind of bring to your attention Utah's definition for college. CCR is college and career readiness for all students. So this is straight from our State Board of Education. And I think, a few years back, they recognized that like just getting a diploma isn't the end all be all, but there's a lot of other skills and things that we want our students to walk away with when they leave our school, so that they can be successful contributing members of our community and have meaningful lives. So this is really what our State Board of Education came up with. Upon completion, all Utah students are prepared to succeed and lead by having the knowledge and skills to learn, engage civically, and lead meaningful lives. I know that's pretty vague, but then it goes on to identify these 13 competencies. So I don't know if you're familiar with Utah's portrait of a graduate, but the State Board of Education went through a whole process, including getting feedback from educators all over the state. And they really asked the question, like, aside from just a high school diploma, what else do you expect our students to kind of have mastered, right? Like, what are the areas that we should be helping them develop and feel like they have all of these skills before they leave. And this is what that whole work group came up with, these 13 competencies. And so the Utah Portrait of a Graduate, I linked it here. So in these slides, you can take a look if you're not familiar with it. But essentially, it takes these 13 competencies and then it sort of backward maps them all the way to elementary school. So you guys that are teaching elementary, don't think this is really just a secondary kind of a concept, but this really does start early on, right? So when you look at academic mastery, I mean, that starts from elementary all the way through high school. This idea of mental wellness and physical wellness, how to understand civics and financial and economic literacy, digital literacy, we start that with students very, very young. Communication skills, critical thinking and problem solving, right? Like these are all things that we develop with students throughout their entire school career. So things like creativity and innovation, being able to collaborate and work together as a team. I mean, that's such an important skill as an adult and in the workplace. And we have to start teaching that early on. Honesty, integrity, and responsibility, hard work and resilience, that's a big one too, right? So when students, have rough spots and failures, that they're able to kind of pick themselves back up and kind of, continue to work towards their goals. This idea of lifelong learning and personal growth, and then service, having this mindset of, serving your community, volunteering, those kinds of things. And then, of course, respect for yourself and others and peers and adults. So this is a lot. It's 13 competencies, but I think the reason I really brought this up is, one, this is what Utah wants for all students, right? So this is also our students with disabilities, but I think in some cases we really have to be super mindful about these things aren't just going to happen on their own. We probably have to set up situations and intentionally teach a lot of these concepts to our students with disabilities. They probably will need more direct instruction, more opportunities, more practice, more encouragement, more support to meet these competencies. But I wanted to show you this so that you can kind of see how a lot of this does overlap, I think, with the predictors that we've spent a long time talking about. And then also with these college and career concepts that you read in Mary Morningstar's study. So we'll kind of crosswalk those a little bit. But I also wanted to point out to you that in our special education rules in Utah, we have a statement that says students with disabilities must have access to all school services related to college and career readiness planning and must be actively invited and included in school activities which address course planning, graduation, and post-secondary education and employment. Things like college weeks, scholarship opportunities, making sure they have access to take the ACT test to get into college, and concurrent enrollment. You might think, well, this is obvious, right? Like all students should be meeting with their school counselors and developing those plans for college and career readiness and do all these activities. But sometimes if a student has a label of special education, they may not be included in these things. So I just want you all to know and I think advocate for your students if they are not getting invited to these or they're not meeting with their school counselor and being, included in these really important activities to help them get ready for post-secondary education, whether they want to go to college or not. And I'm not saying that college is necessarily the route for every student, but they should have exposure, right, to all of these options and support if they want to explore these. So just so that you're aware, I mean, this was added to our rules, I want to say maybe about 9 or 10 years ago, because what was happening was students with disabilities in Utah weren't necessarily meeting with their school counselors and they weren't invited to some of these activities. I think one that came out of maybe low expectations. The other, it might have been, well, the school counselor really doesn't deal with students with disabilities because they have a teacher case manager that takes care of everything. But you as a special ed teacher, you have a lot of expertise and you have a lot on your plate, but you shouldn't also act as a school counselor, right? That's not your job. So I hope that you have some relationships with your school counselor, or if you identify some of these barriers, that you might be able to have some conversations in your setting with your school counselors and your admin to say, how come my students are not getting invited to all of these activities? Because this is important. And we want to set that expectation. So for what that's worth, I wanted to make sure you were all aware of that. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what Mary Morningstar found out in this research of what are these really important domains specifically for students with disabilities to make sure that they are college and career ready. So obviously this idea of academic engagement, right, which first and foremost, I think starts with making sure that students are having access to the general core curriculum on their grade level, whether that needs to be, modified or accommodated. We always want to kind of start there, right, before we pull a student from a core class or any kind of an academic class. So that's important, but it's not just limited to just those core curriculum necessarily. We'll talk a little bit more about what academic engagement means because it's more than just exposure to the content. And then this idea of mindsets is important as well. And then this learning process, critical thinking, interpersonal engagement or social skills, I guess we could call that as well. And then transition competencies, right? Or transition knowledge. And that really encompasses a lot. So on the next slide, we'll kind of break all of this down. But you can already see some alignment, I think, with again, the predictors, because in the predictors, we talk about transition programs, we talk about access to general ed, we talk about youth autonomy and resilience and those things that are kind of align with mindset. So you can already kind of start to see there is a lot of overlap. But let's kind of dive into what we mean by all of these and operationalize them. And hopefully you got that from the article, but we'll just review it again. So really, I've highlighted a couple of the areas under each one of these domains that I think are really important. So under academic, content, obviously we're talking about language arts, math, and science, social studies, and especially career tech ed. But I know we've talked a lot about CTE, but making sure students have equal opportunities to access all of those regular education opportunities that all students should have access to. And then I kind of highlighted behaviors here because what I mean by that is, attendance is super important. Productivity, work habits, class participation, course completion, those kinds of things. And right now, you probably have noticed we're having a pretty huge issue with attendance in our state. And actually, this is a national issue too, right? With COVID, we have not bounced back really. We have a lot of chronically absent students since COVID, and some of that is because I don't know, attitudes I think towards attendance have shifted a little bit, right? Parents sometimes feel like, well, they can just hop online or go to Canvas and kind of make up the work, but we know from the research that if students are chronically absent, it really, really impacts them. And I can also tell you from a state standpoint that our students with disabilities have higher rates of chronic absenteeism than the general ed population. Some of that probably has to do with things like anxiety and other disabilities that might be sort of getting in the way, but it is a big issue, right? So we kind of need to pay attention. How do we incentivize or motivate our students to make sure that they are attending? Because we know that chronic absenteeism leads to dropout, right? And if students aren't there and they're not completing, that's really, really going to impact not only whether they graduate or not, but how successful they are when they leave school. So that's an important one. Mindset, we talk a lot about like growth mindset, making sure that students aren't afraid to make mistakes, also that we allow for them to make mistakes and then learn from those, that they have some self-awareness, self-monitoring, goal setting. These are all things that we talked about in the predictors, perseverance, helping students kind of pick themselves up when they've failed or had a rough time, to kind of see this motivation to continue. But what I highlighted here was this idea of sense of belonging, because I think we can't get some of these other concepts or qualities, I think, in a student unless we address the foundation. And to me, the foundation is trusting relationships. And that's so important, right? Like there's a lot of research around if a student that is at risk, and oftentimes our students with disabilities are at risk, have a really trusted adult in the school that, cares about them and checks in with them and holds them accountable, that can make such a huge difference. So I think, connecting with students and having that trusting relationship first and foremost is super, super important. And then this idea of the next bullet under sense of belonging is that idea of extracurricular engagement. So often, I interview a lot of students when I go to schools, students with disabilities. I do these focus groups and I ask them like, what do you love about school? And I can tell you 9 out of 10 times they say it's the club they're in or the sport they're in or their friends, right? Like that's what they tell me they love about school. I mean, they do sometimes talk about, liking their teachers and their subjects, but by and large, it is their relationships with students and the fun stuff that gets them excited about coming to school, which oftentimes is extracurricular activities. So I think we can't discount those. I think we should talk about those at the IEP. And if a student has issues with transportation, like they can't stay after school because the bus has left, and how do they get back home? Like we need to be somehow flexible and supportive so that students can do those extracurricular activities because they make a huge difference. All right, we're going to move on to learning processes. And I kind of highlighted the top there, accessing content. So test taking skills, note taking skills, time management, organizational. So I think we've talked about this before, but this to me is all about executive functioning, right? This is all this idea of the stuff that adults do every day and that we expect students to start to be able to do on their own is that idea of using a planner, planning out assignments, understanding how to use technology, metacognition, which really is kind of thinking about thinking, right? So having them be reflective about their own processes. So this to me just kind of screams executive functioning, which I feel like so many of our students with disabilities really need. So making sure that we're addressing that, teaching that, whether we're embedding it in general content or we have a special, like a directed studies class where we're teaching these things. There's a really, really great book called Executive Functioning for Teens, and it kind of has like a super simple checklist where students can assess their own skills around these executive functioning skills, and then they can set goals and learn about what executive functioning skills they maybe are weak in and need to work on. So highly recommend checking out that book. And then we'll move on to the next one, critical thinking, right? These are things like problem solving, right? Like, again, a huge adult skill. This is something we use all the time, but if we are solving all problems for our students, they're not going to learn that skill themselves. I highlighted the concept of communication here. So, communication is so important, whether that be verbal or written, knowing how to appropriately write emails or talk to an instructor, talk to your coworkers, your peers, right? Again, these are those so critical skills that transfer into the workplace and into those post-secondary college settings when a student with a disability no longer will have a special ed teacher or a parent by their side doing all these things. So super important for them to learn that. And then interpersonal engagement, so much of that is really, having responsibility, social awareness, empathy, being able to kind of understand where other people are coming from. And then the last one, transition competencies, and that list is very long. But again, that's all the stuff that we're talking about, how important transition is, right? Early planning, making sure that we have goals that are tied to the students' interests, making sure that we um, are teaching them, financial skills, financial literacy, transportation, adult living. I mean, the list goes on. This is trying to anticipate all of the things they're going to need to know and be able to do once they are adults and leave high school, right? So look at that list. It's like longer than all the rest of them. So I think this really just kind of makes the point that, wow, transition is important. Even though I know we spend so much of our time and effort on academics, we have to figure out ways that we can include all of these important transition skills, whether that be in a separate class or embed them or outside of school or making sure parents are kind of teaching some of these things, but we cannot discount this, right? We don't want students leaving with a diploma, but none of these transition skills, so that they will kind of flounder when they get out of school into these post-secondary settings where they need these skills. So with that, I also wanted to point out another tool that I think might be really useful. But a couple of years ago, myself and my colleagues reached out and communicated with our college partners. So when I mean that, we reached out to disability resource centers at our colleges in Utah and some of our programs for students with intellectual and developmental disability programs. And we said to them, we asked them essentially, when students show up at your campus, what are you seeing in terms of skill gaps? What are the skills that they're not coming with, right? And they identified actually 10 different areas. And this is just a little screenshot of the first two. So the domain area of self-advocacy and social interactions. And there are 8 more on this whole document. And I've linked this on the last slide, so you can take a look at this. But essentially, we took those 10 big areas that our college partners were saying, gosh, if teachers in the K-12 system could work on these skills a little bit more, and if parents could help encourage and foster these skills more with our students, they would come to our college campuses in a better position, right? They would have some of these skills. But then we recognize, well, we can't just be working on these things the last year of high school or even throughout 3 years or 4 years of high school. We really have to start thinking about these skills early on, pre-K and through elementary. So what we did is we backwards mapped this idea of, okay, what does self-advocacy look like? So in 12th grade, if we want a student to be able to discuss their own ability and communicate the accommodations that they need and lead their own IEP and advocate for their own needs, like that's the expectation when you get to college, right? But that's a lot. That takes a lot of years, I think, of development. So if we map that to pre-K, we're talking about simple things like verbal requesting, saying no, expressing preferences. Then in elementary, K5, it might be the student being able to communicate their wants and needs, awareness that they have a disability. I've seen fourth graders talk very openly about the fact that they have autism, what that means, right? So it's really kind of not tiptoeing around that, but really making sure the student understands their strengths, but also their disabilities and their needs. So starting that stuff early. In sixth and eighth grade, describing their own strengths and their support needs, explaining their disability, actively participating in their IEP. There's no reason why, as early as sixth grade, a student can't be actively participating in their IEP. So the idea here really is this tool, we hope that teachers will look at it and say, oh, okay, I can start transition, in kindergarten or all through elementary. And how can I do that? How can I make sure that I'm using some of these opportunities to teach these skills? So I hope you find this helpful. We also would love it if you'd share this with parents and talk openly at the IEP about all the things that maybe parents could be doing to help their students teach these skills or learn these skills as well. So that is our post-secondary transition skills mapping tool. There's a whole Padlet for it. So I've linked that on the last slide. So please check that out. I hope you find it useful and share it out. And so how do we ensure? I know that I think the tough part is, gosh, you guys already have so much on your plate. So how do we make sure that we are not only doing all of the other things you have to do and to teach students, but how do we get these skills really embedded, right, in a student's day? So I think always looking for opportunities to teach problem solving, right? Like not solving all the problems for students, but trying to intentionally make it so that they have to do some of their own problem solving. And I think if you're mindful of that, you can kind of build that into the day. Allow for opportunities to collaborate. So, hopefully there's opportunities for students to be involved in group types of projects and work, whether that be in a gen ed or in some other setting. And this idea of fostering positive relationships with teen students and adults, right? Like so often our students with disabilities are sort of isolated or they don't really have great relationships and friends. So whatever you can do to kind of foster and support that. And then we already talked about this idea of really encouraging extracurricular activities, but I can't stress enough how important that actually is. I mean, we think about it as like this aside thing, but I would say, let's talk about this at IEPs, let's make sure students are involved in extracurricular activities because they're really important. And then explicitly teaching critical thinking skills, right? So this is something that I think isn't just going to occur on its own, but making sure that we kind of maybe we think out loud to students with our own critical thinking skills. So we model that. And then we expect them, to have those critical thinking skills and provide them feedback. We talked about exposing students to rigorous content. So making sure that we're not just quickly pulling students out of difficult classes, but figuring out how we can support them and keep them in those courses. And then encouraging the CT pathways. And I know I've mentioned that a lot, but I can't stress that enough either, because we know that if students have CTE experiences and pathways and certificates, that they have really much better outcomes in many ways in employment and for their education and training. All right. So lastly, I do want to talk about where some of these things are. So I haven't mentioned the career development credential, but this is something that is available to students with disabilities. And essentially it was created in 2018 by the state board. And what it is it is a credential that students can earn. It's not a diploma. It's kind of like, it's like a CTE credential in some ways that a student can get along with their diploma. But this one it's career focused. So what I mean by that is a student has to have taken at least a couple of classes in a CTE pathway. They have to have done a work-based learning internship, and they also have to have exposure to this transition curriculum. So that means things like soft skills, disability awareness, knowing kind of the laws around disability accommodations when they leave high school. Other things are self-advocacy skills. So there's a transition curriculum that they need to have some exposure to earn this credential. They have to have that CTE pathway. They have to have a certain number of hours of work-based learning experience, and paid employment. So if you click on that link, it will take you to a Padlet, and it will explain a lot more in detail what that career development credential is all about. Then the second one, that transition mapping skills tool that I just showed you that snapshot of, but that takes you to a Padlet that has the entire tool with all 10 competency areas and a whole lot more. It takes you to a Padlet that has other tools around helping our students be prepared for college settings. And then Utah's Portrait of a Graduate, I wanted to make sure you have that. That is the Portrait of a Graduate that actually maps all the way back to elementary. So you can kind of see how those 13 competencies are kind of grade banded and how we start to make sure that we hit all those competencies early and throughout a student's high school or entire school career. And then the last link is called the Plan for College and Career Readiness. For short, that's usually called the PCCR plan. And that is something that school counselors are supposed to do with every student. They usually have their first one in 8th grade as they get ready for those high school years, kind of mapping out courses, and they should have done some kinds of assessments around, what they might be interested in careers. And then depending upon the school, counselors will usually revisit that college and career readiness plan with the student and the parent, at least annually, or at least again in 10th grade or 11th grade. It varies a little bit differently in each school. But oftentimes our students with disabilities aren't necessarily um, developing those plans with a school counselor. I hope that's happening. You can definitely give me some feedback if you know what's going on in your setting. But ideally, if we can align that college and career readiness plan that they do with the school counselor together with the transition plan, right? Because in many ways, those two plans have a lot of the same things on them, right? So we want to make sure those are ideally done at the same time, or at least they are aligned, or they're informing each other. So if the student has done that college and readiness plan with a counselor, and then they have their IEP like a month later, hopefully we have access to that college and career readiness plan and it's aligned with the transition plan, or vice versa. So I wanted to point those resources out to you, and let me know if you have any questions, and otherwise I'll see you all next week. Thanks, you guys.